Welcome. I'm Helen Atkinson, Managing Editor at Supply Chain Brain. I'm excited to be moderating this webinar today, presented by Gartner, sponsored by GEP, the title for which is Supply Chain Sustainability Strategy to Action. Later in the webinar, we're going to open up for a Q&A session with questions from you, the audience. Please submit questions at any time using the tab at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using people's titles or company names, so go ahead and ask anything you like. If you don't see your question come up during the webinar, please be assured Gartner will reach out to you offline. But first, we're going to have a presentation from our speaker from Gartner. After that, we'll have an Ask the Expert panel discussion, and then we'll get into a Q&A session. Here's our topic. Supply chain leaders face increasing expectations around their supply chain's sustainability performance from regulators and other stakeholders, while cost savings and business growth remain key priorities. In this webinar, a Gartner expert will give supply chain leaders key strategies to leverage the legislative landscape, engage the organization, and deliver progress towards sustainability goals in this increasingly demanding context. We'll build awareness around sustainability and how to drive progress towards goals. We'll also give guidance on how leaders can make sustainability-informed decisions. We'll also talk about how to link actions to impact. So let's meet our presenter. Laura Rainier is Senior Director Analyst within Gartner's Supply Chain Group. Laura has 12 years of experience designing and embedding ESG strategies into core business practices in a large corporate environment. She's served on the steering committee of key business and multi-stakeholder initiatives, including the Global Fashion Agenda and the UN International Labour Organization's Global Business Network on Forced Labour. In addition to her role at Gartner, Laura is an adjunct professor of sustainable supply chain at Bard University's MBA in sustainability. So she really knows what she's talking about. And we're delighted to say that Laura is presenting at the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium Expo, May 6th to 8th in Orlando. That's less than 3 weeks away. Today's content is similar to what you'll experience on site and in person at the expo. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now let's get into this presentation.
Lovely. Let's get started. So welcome, everyone. Really looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you today. And I want to start by sharing some of our recent research around supply chains broadly. Each year we at Gartner, we ask CEOs and senior business leaders what key challenges they face. And you can see here, probably won't surprise many of you watching today, that complexity is one of the key challenges that really surfaced from this exercise. And we find that CEOs and senior business leaders point to the fact that their supply chains are dangerously complex. 76% of globalized supply chains have become dangerously complex and brittle. Now, I'm here to talk about sustainability. So what does that have to do with sustainability? Well, a couple of key things. First, sustainability-related challenges are driving some of this complexity, right? We're seeing increased legislative requirements, stakeholder expectations, and of course, even the impact of climate change. All of these things are contributing to supply chain complexity. And secondly, and probably more positively, the sustainability strategy can help us to mitigate or at least more efficiently manage much of this complexity. So let's dig in a little bit in terms of kind of what is happening in sustainability and supply chain sustainability in particular. And when I think about kind of the complexity within supply chain sustainability, I often picture this kind of poor soul who's trying to put together a new piece of furniture, right? A piece of kind of DIY furniture. And, you know, I think that's how many of us feel in supply chain sustainability, right? There's a lot of moving parts. We need to figure out how it all works together in a way that is going to drive progress forward. And so I've highlighted a few of the key pressures here. Some of these pressures are driving action and progress towards performance and sustainability. And some of them are actually creating pressure that challenges our ability to deliver our sustainability goals. And so that's sort of what these arrows are reflecting, right? So I'll talk you through some of these key pressures facing supply chain sustainability leaders and supply chain leaders overall. First, legislative pressures, right? These might be top of mind for you if you're working in supply chain, right? New regulatory requirements, increased expectations around due diligence and traceability. And most of the legislative requirements we've seen over the past couple of years are driving more action in sustainability, requiring companies to do more, to understand more about what's going on in their supply chain. But I also want to note that there are some legislative developments that are creating challenges for companies that might actually mitigate their progress towards their sustainability goals. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. We're seeing stakeholder pressures, right? Stakeholder pressures, I would say that in our research, we find that consistently, whenever we ask, what is the biggest driver of your sustainability work, we always find that it is coming from customers. And so customers are one of those key stakeholders that are really driving kind of action in sustainability. Of course, there's other important stakeholders that are driving progress as well. And when I say customers, I refer to both kind of B2C customers as well as B2B customers. And so if we look to our research in sustainable procurement, we see that the vast majority of procurement leaders that we survey are increasing their focus on sustainable procurement, right? Increasing the importance of their sustainable procurement strategies, meaning that if you're serving some of these kind of B2B customers who are focused on sustainable procurement, there's a whole lot of pressure to drive progress in this space. But of course, there's also some skepticism around green claims, right? There's some pressure that's pushing back against some of this progress. We've got ambitious goals, right? And many organizations, significant number of organizations have set very ambitious goals like science-based targets, emissions reduction targets. And these are coming due, that timeline is coming due pretty quickly. And so really, many supply chains are looking to kind of drive progress towards achievement of those ambitious goals. And then lastly, we all face competing priorities, right? This isn't new. Competing priorities are always a challenge, particularly in the sustainability space. But in 2024, we're seeing even more challenges as our supply chains deal with issues like persistent inflation and rising interest rates and geopolitical disruption. And so what does this mean for sustainability and supply chains, right? What is the outlook going forward? Well, when, here at Gartner, we have a tool called the hype cycle. And we use this hype cycle to understand and make sense of the noise around new technologies or strategies. And most innovations follow this hype cycle curve. You can see it on the right of the slide, right? We begin by learning about a new solution and getting very excited about it. This leads us to the peak of inflated expectations. And then we realize that maybe the solution isn't a miracle, right? Maybe it won't solve all of our problems and some of our excitement wanes. And that brings us to this trough of disillusionment. And ultimately, we determine that there are some very useful applications for the solution or strategy, and we advance to this plateau of productivity. Now, the hype cycle is helpful as we think about really new trends, new strategies, but certainly as we think about supply chain sustainability. Now, some of the pressures we've just discussed, including legislation, are making us reset, right? Things like the EU's greenwashing directive, which requires a whole lot of rigor around any claims that we make about the sustainability performance or sustainability of our products, right? And some political pushback in the US around ESG. Both of these things mean that we need to exercise more caution when we communicate around sustainability. And then meanwhile, we're seeing things like disclosure requirements, due diligence requirements that are requiring supply chains to take more action, report on outcomes. And of course, customers pushing us to take action as well, right? And so we have this opportunity to sort of reset, to ensure that we have a strong foundation in place and move forward in an authentic and productive way on our sustainability strategy. Right, to go sort of from strategy to sort of authentic action. And so what I wanted to share with you today was kind of two keys to success on delivering your sustainability goals, on attaining that plateau of productivity. And so I hope that this conversation will help you move from that kind of mess of DIY furniture pieces to a clear sense of the task and what comes next. And to do that, we'll talk about two things. First, we'll talk about how to equip the supply chain organization to deliver progress. And then we'll touch on how supply chain leaders can connect across the organization to inform design decisions and to enable sustainability. So we'll begin by talking a little bit about equipping the organization, about how we enable our supply chain colleagues to work in alignment with our sustainability goals. And why do we need to equip the organization in the first place, right? Why does this matter? Well, our research shows that better awareness of sustainability across the organization is highly correlated with improved performance towards sustainability goals, right? So if people in your organization know your sustainability strategy, then you're more likely to achieve your goals. And so there's a couple of components to this awareness, though, right? The first is what I just said, right? Those across the organization, employees across the organization can say, answer the question, what are my organization's sustainability goals? And that is probably an obvious point, right? Everybody should understand and have some sense of what our organization's sustainability goals are. But this alone is, of course, insufficient. And so the key to building awareness is really clarifying this question that is on the screen, right? What do sustainability goals mean for me? And so when we build this awareness of sustainability in an actionable way, right? How do our sustainability goals impact my decision making as a leader across the supply chain organization, right? When everyone knows what their role is and has clear KPIs, that's when we can really unlock progress towards our goals. Now, the best way to build this awareness is through managers by cascading and contextualizing goals throughout the organization through a top-down approach. And once we've built this awareness, right, we need to embed our sustainability goals into ways of working and decision making. And according to our research, supply chains and organizations have some work to do here. You can see here on the screen, only 28% of employees report that sustainability goals are embedded into their daily workflow. And this is a challenge I often hear from clients, right, around this kind of competing priorities, right? So I was recently speaking with a supply chain leader in the food industry who said, yes, we have sustainability goals that we need to achieve. They're embedded in our goals. They're something that, it truly is made to matter for our leaders across the organization. But we also have cost targets, right? So guess what happens when these goals are in conflict, right? We're likely to choose, our cost targets under the assumption that those are the more important ones. Not to suggest that all of these, decisions require trade-offs, but there certainly are some. And so where we run into these challenges, it's critical to provide clear decision guidance. Now, like most hard decisions, it's more efficient and more helpful, more effective, right, to navigate these trade-offs when you've considered them upfront. So providing decision guidance to leaders across the organization gives them the tools to effectively navigate these trade-off decisions when things become challenging. And there's different approaches to providing decision guidance. You can see here, we've got some nudge approaches all the way to sort of more of a push approach. Now, nudges provide strategic direction through values or guidance, such as decision principles or design principles. And these principles provide clarity around how leaders should navigate tough decisions that require trade-offs. For example, high margin, low turnover, right? That's a principle that suggests a strategic decision and trade-off that informs the company's strategy and its leaders' decisions. So really providing those guardrails for organizational decision making. And we can get to more of a push by using sort of tangible parameters. So decision guidance that uses tangible parameters provides a little bit more clarity around the organization's appetite to invest. So going beyond principles to start to say, this is, here are the numbers, or here is the kind of clear guidance. An example of this is a green premium target, which provides leaders with the flexibility to accept a defined percentage price increase to invest in a more sustainable option or solution. And then lastly, there's the real push approach, right, where we can provide both guidance and incentives. And this provides, those tangible parameters, but also incentives that encourage more sustainable decisions. Now, an internal carbon price, which applies an internal charge based on the emissions implications of decisions, is a common sort of push approach. And so these types of decision criteria, right, can be embedded into strategic decisions and investments, as well as through operational decisions. So I'm sharing a slide here just to give you a view of how might this be embedded into capital expenditure decision making, right? We're seeing a whole lot more companies start to incorporate sustainability considerations and criteria into their capital investment processes. And this is key because capital investments are often long-term and might be exposed to climate risks in the future. So when we think about the capital expenditure process, within the supply chain context, we might start with, applying a financial lens, right, and assessing kind of the feasibility of a project in the first place. Then we apply sustainability criteria, looking both at the operational sustainability impact of a particular investment, as well as looking at some of the future sustainability risks that this investment might expose the organization to. So really kind of starting to embed sustainability and embed this thinking into these big decisions that we make at a strategic level. And so the strategic decisions are key. So are the operational decisions. And I want to share an example of an organization that's doing some really interesting things in terms of equipping their leaders and decision makers with clear decision criteria and systems to navigate these kind of difficult trade-offs and operational decisions, right? So this is the European sporting goods retailer Decathlon takes this sort of push approach that I just discussed, right? Equipping buyers with a tool that guides their order allocation using financial metrics. So they've applied and built a tool that estimates supplier greenhouse gas emissions, applies a cost of carbon to translate those greenhouse gas emissions into dollars and cents, and then provides financial metrics that consider the cost of carbon to recommend order allocation. So really enabling the organization and those leaders across the organization to look at two different options and understand the emissions implications of those decisions as they consider order allocation.
Hi, as a reminder, the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium Expo is May 6th to 8th in Orlando. That's less than 3 weeks away. You're going to get the opportunity to rethink your supply chain and learn alongside CSCOs and supply chain executives for pragmatic advice and future-focused insight for supply chains to deliver now and in the future. For more information, go to gartner.com/US/supply chain, and you'll see on your screen now there's a code for $650 off the registration fee. That's GARTSCB24. This webinar is brought to you by GEP. Net zero emissions, supply chain sustainability, supplier diversity. These aren't just good to have goals anymore. GEP partners with leading enterprises to enable their procurement and supply chain functions to drive ESG goals across the value chain. We help organizations determine baselines, set targets, measure performance, and make quantifiable progress to become ESG leaders. We also provide the right technology to maintain improvements and become more efficient for a sustainable and responsible future. Visit GEP.com to get started.
Great. Perfect. So we talked about some of the key ways we can equip the supply chain organization to deliver progress towards our sustainability goals, right? The second key to success that I want to talk to you about a little bit today is design, relates to design solutions. And design is a key point of leverage in sustainability. So small changes in design can deliver significant returns down the line. And we're seeing more supply chain leaders engaging with their colleagues, making design decisions. In fact, according to the European Commission, we see that 80% of a product's environmental footprint is determined, in the design phase. So design is that key point of leverage for sustainability. Now, when I talk about design today, I'm going to be referring to design in two key ways, actually. The first is, of course, product design, right? And so this is really around how do we engage with those leaders across the organization that are focused on product design. That might mean R&D, right? Product development, engineering, right? So a range of organizations that are making those sort of design decisions. And then the other key way that I refer, a type of design that I'm referring to is actually supply chain design, right? And so this might include our network footprint, our locations of key facilities, our inventory management approach and planning. And so when we determine our goals and optimize for them early during supply chain design and planning, there's just more levers, available to enable our sustainability goals. And so, one of the key recommendations then really is actually that supply chains need to, with respect to product design, really connect more deeply with product design. Now, in our research, we conduct a Gartner Top 25 supply chain research exercise each year, where we look at the leading organizations and determine those top supply chains. And in this research, we found that 51% of companies included in the analysis reported that supply chain owns and executes the new product introduction process. And a significant portion as well engage deeply in that process, even if they don't own it. So supply chain, this is kind of becoming more of a trend over time, and we're starting to see increased collaboration between supply chain and design engineering, right? Those that are making design decisions. So I recently spoke with a tech company that has actually structured their supply chain organization in order to enable deep collaboration with design. And so the company's developed an organization within its supply chain organization called product operations. And this is embedded, like I said, within their supply chain organization to connect supply chain to engineering and product management and to influence the design of the products early in the process. This product operations applies two sets of tangible considerations to all new products in development, addressing product design and supply chain design. So with respect to product design, they apply a circular design evaluation tool so that any new products that are designed undergo this assessment. And ideally, a significant number of them actually, meet the best practices outlined in this tool. And then secondly, they look at supply chain design during this design process, right? So a new product sourcing and risk management approach is considered against a comprehensive set of criteria, including country of origin for input materials, multi-sourcing considerations, right? Really making sure that we are sort of before the cake is baked, right? That we're putting the ingredients in the right place. And so that kind of connecting with design early in the process is a key part of, enabling and unlocking progress towards our sustainability goals. We also need to kind of embed sustainability, as I said, into supply chain design. And embedding sustainability into supply chain design is associated with higher sustainability performance. And so, in an example, our research evaluates organizations that embed sustainability into their strategies and what we call build-in companies, and compares them to companies that consider sustainability as more of an added activity. And these are what we call bolt-on companies. So when we look at build-in companies versus bolt-in companies, bolt-on companies, right? A key feature of build-in companies is that sustainability is the top driver of supply chain network changes today. So when we look at build-in companies, 31% of those companies are already embedding sustainability as a key factor in their decision-making around the supply chain network. Oops. Sorry, there we go. And these building companies are significantly more likely to embed sustainability into decisions around supply chain network changes. They're also more likely to achieve their sustainability goals. In fact, they're 2.6 times more likely to make their portfolio more sustainable. So, this kind of thinking about sustainability early in that network design or kind of as we're making network decisions is highly, associated with better outcomes when it comes to our sustainability goals. And so with that, I just want to kind of quickly wrap up the presentation with a quote that I think sums up the key points shared today, right? Sustainability, like profitability, is an outcome which requires the entire organization to deliver, right? So as we think about kind of enabling the organization to deliver, we do need to think about those two key things, right? We need to think about how do we equip the organization to deliver on our goals? And then how do we identify those key points of leverage and then really drive progress in those particular areas? And that's where, we see kind of really engaging deeply with design. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions and conversation.
Thank you so much, Laura. I love the emphasis on getting product design right and connecting design with supply chain operations, as well as getting sustainability embedded into supply chain design. That's terrific. Now we're going to move into an Ask the Expert panel discussion with a conversation between the two of us.
Brilliant.
Laura, I think we're looking at a situation right now where there's a lot going on with inflation and disruptions, and sustainability goals aren't a top priority for a lot of supply chain leaders right now with everything going on. How do you see organizations maintaining momentum?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one that I sought to sort of touch on throughout the conversation, right? Because I think that point around competing priorities is one that I'm hearing quite regularly from clients. We are dealing with a whole lot of different challenges and different things coming at us. And so, I would suggest that as we look at maintaining momentum, it's really around how do we how do we make sure that we're bringing in leaders who are enabling sustainability rather than necessarily doing kind of sustainability specific projects? And so that kind of idea of equipping the organization, I'm going to double down on that quickly and suggest that, find your allies, right? Leverage change management best practices and really make progress around, make progress through your colleagues and sort of enable decision making that's in alignment with our goals.
Great, thank you. So there's been a lot of legislation, increasingly ambitious legislation in sustainability, but recently some of it's being watered down. I think we saw recently that Scope 3 emissions were going to be left out of certain regulations. Where do you see this going, and what are your thoughts on that? Are we going backwards?
I think it's a good question. I think there's definitely the point that progress isn't always linear, right? That there is always going to be somewhat of a bumpy road. But I would suggest that the general trend is very clear, and the overarching trend towards sort of sustainability becoming compliance is absolutely one that is very much clearly continuing, right? And so I think the last couple of years have shown us that there is, absolutely more rigor, more expectations is where things are going. Now, yes, over the past couple of months, we've seen some things be watered down, and some legislations are not as maybe ambitious as we had initially expected. But I think, we definitely they are still quite ambitious, right? And so I think that's kind of the main thing that we're seeing is that, we might have thought we were going to kind of reach the moon and we're landing among the stars.
Right. We're all lying in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the
Right,
stars.
that's true.
That's what I said. So basically, the message is it's not going away, and the legislation is going to keep coming. Is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
absolutely. And maybe I'll give you an example. I think there's been a lot of talk and focus on the SEC and the climate requirements coming out of the SEC. Now that currently has been paused, and we will see where that goes. But I think that one of the things that we've seen with the SEC requirements is, to your point, scope 3, right? Value chain emissions reporting is not a part of the ultimate rule that was published. Now, still, organizations that have set scope 3 goals need to report on their progress towards those goals under the SEC because they need to report about they need to report on their commitments and their progress towards their commitments, right? And so I think that there's certainly a lot of nuance in here, but there's still a whole lot of stringency and likely to be a pretty big increased expectation on companies and particularly supply chains, around some of these regulations. So they might be softened, but they're still likely to really change the way you work in a big way. And so something for supply chain leaders to pay attention to.
Right, right. Thank you. Well, speaking of supply chain leaders, all of the recommendations that you shared in your lovely presentation assume that there is leadership buy-in and engagement in sustainability. So, what if there's not? What do you
Yeah,
recommend when it's not prioritized by leadership?
yeah. I mean, this is a tough one, and it's certainly one that is, um, you know, is facing a lot of organizations, right? I think there's a couple of key things that I would recommend for those who are sort of facing this challenge. The first is that where possible, if it's not prioritized by leadership, do what is needed to capture the investment that is needed, right? And so we have some research coming out around kind of how do we motivate the organization around resource constraints, which is sort of related to sustainability. And what we see in that research is that organizations that actually kind of look at current urgent challenges, actually, and use those urgent challenges to motivate action, can still design solutions that ultimately address those near and long-term challenges. So, for example, an organization that we recognized in Gartner through a Power of the Profession Award, one of our Gartner kind of awards, had done some really interesting things. This is a Karachi-based electric utility. So, and what they did was during the chip crisis, they ran into some challenges around accessing, PCB boards for their electric meters. And what they actually did, because they weren't able to get those chips, and they also weren't able to they were facing increasing demand. So they were struggling, is they developed an entire circular process to address this chip challenge. But it ultimately provided a whole lot of additional benefit from a sustainability perspective, right? So they took these meters and were able to partner with suppliers to sort of circulate and recycle meters and refurbish them and reuse them. And so by building this kind of solution, this refurbishment and sort of circular solution, they were more effectively, circulating the metals in those meters and the other components. But it was all driven by kind of one urgent challenge. Of course, the chip challenge is a very specific and certainly really kind of top of mind challenge for a lot of organizations that were in industries relying on those inputs. But still, the concept is one that you can consider and apply within your organization, right? Determining what are the urgent things we're facing and how do we leverage our sustainability strategy to actually address some of those urgent challenges that we're facing and sort of deliver value in that way. And of course, in addition to that, how do we work through others, right? And how do we begin to kind of think about some of those other design solutions as we talked about?
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like what you're recommending is if you're a department head or, a supply chain leader and you're not getting buy-in from the C level at this point, that you meet your goals, but try and bake some sustainability in, and then possibly go and report to the C level and say, hey, look, this is what we did, and we baked in some sustainability considerations, and we got this bottom line result, or this beneficial result. Is that one approach to take?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one approach to take is exactly as you described, right? Determining where we can do things, using those like effective implementation and effective outcomes, right? To build momentum, right? Absolutely, that is one. And the other is, where we sort of, I guess the point being kind of how do we communicate effectively? How do we kind of determine where sustainability is a solution to our key challenges, right? So I open the conversation with this idea of complexity, right? Complexity is a huge challenge for supply chains, for organizations overall. how do our sustainability strategies actually solve for some of that? And there are ways that they do. And so if we can determine, where we can find sustainability solutions that are actually solving our urgent business problems, that's where I think you're going to make sure that you do continue to kind of build some of that momentum.
Right, right. But as you said, also right at the top, there is investment involved in achieving sustainability in an overall strategic sense, and
Yeah.
and you really do want to try and work to get as high a level of buy-in as you possibly can. And I know that's a challenge in a lot of companies where they're dealing with all these other issues. Given the need to embed sustainability into an organization, ideally, do you recommend a decentralized sustainability team approach? You want to have a separate team that's overarching, or do you see supply chain teams owning sustainability goals, within each department?
Yeah. It's it's a question I get from clients a lot, which is like, how should we structure our
Yeah.
sustainability organization, right? Where should it sit? How does it look? I think, the way that I generally answer the question is that, of course, the classic, there's no necessarily one size fits all, but I think the key is to make sure that we have some balance, right, between sort of strategic guidance and oversight, as well as embedding and orchestrating sustainability across the organization. And so when you know supply chain leaders come to me and say, hey, I've got the budget or the ability to hire two people, I generally recommend, great, make sure that if you have a limited budget and you can have only a small team, focus on bringing in orchestrators, right? And that kind of I think reinforces some of the conversation earlier, right? Focus on bringing those leaders in that can connect the dots and enable the organization to kind of work together in order to deliver on their sustainability goals, rather than doers. So bringing on those orchestrators is key. And then also, ensuring we've got all of those key capabilities in place that are needed to deliver a solid supply chain program or a supply chain sustainability program, right? We need our governance structures in place to be solid. We need to have clear accountability around around the achievement of the goals that we've set, right? Who kind of owns that, and how are they sort of incentivized accordingly? And then of course we need to make sure we've got the tools, the systems, the real kind of enablers, right? That enable us to achieve those goals.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot, but yeah. It's quite challenging, and definitely. But I love that you give people an idea of where to start. That it's a bit like building a DIY piece of furniture, and got to figure it out. So here's the inevitable question about AI. How do you expect generative AI to impact organizations' achievement of sustainability goals?
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, there's always got to be one, right? At this point in every conversation, I think when we think about generative AI and probably even technology more broadly, we tend to kind of think about two things. The first being, what is the impact of the technology itself, right? What is the sort of sustainability impact or environmental impact of the equipment or of the solution or technology? And then secondly, of course, what is the ability of the solution to deliver value? And so I guess you could call that the sort of footprint and the handprint, right? Generative AI has a huge footprint. And I think, that is definitely something to be aware of, to mitigate, and to be sure to, address as much as possible. It's going to be, I think, in the near term, a really big challenge for emissions reduction strategies in particular, right? So that's sort of the footprint piece. But of course, we need to think about the handprint. And I think there's so many applications. We've done a little bit of research into what are some of the applications in terms of, environmental impact that generative AI can deliver, and just all of these hard questions around data, right, that we struggle with. And that's such a huge challenge in the sustainability space, right? Getting the data right, informing decision making, right? A lot of the things that I mentioned have the opportunity to really be enhanced using generative AI. So I think I tend to be, a sort of stubborn sustainability optimist, I think, and definitely focus on how do we leverage these solutions to really kind of accelerate progress. So I think there's more promise there than there is challenge, but we do need to be aware and clear-eyed that generative AI is very energy intensive and accordingly right now, very emissions intensive.
Right. Yes. Apparently, every time you ask Chat GPT a question, it takes up the equivalent of a bottle of water. Not just electricity
Yeah.
and emissions. Do you have any specific examples of where you've seen AI applications help drive towards sustainability goals, or is it too early to talk about those?
Starting to see just a few. I think one is, in just kind of optimizing logistics and sort of trucking routes, right? Starting to see some interesting applications there, or even overall shipment routes. I think we'll see more in kind of digital twin, digital planning twin, the ability to assess some difficult trade-offs, right? So one of my favorite trade-offs is, as we think about moving our goods from shipping by air to shipping by sea, that is a clear emissions reduction. But it also can result in increased inventory. And I think as organizations think about those types of challenges, they need to navigate and consider those trade-offs, because increased inventory, let's say you're, in the food business, can absolutely result in increased wasted goods, increased kind of shrinkage, and ultimately significant emissions, right? And so, when we look at supply chains, we see that generally the biggest driver of greenhouse gas emissions is in purchased goods and services and the things that we buy. And so, really important to consider some of those trade-offs and some of those challenges. Generative AI can help us think through those a lot more quickly than we can do on our own. And so, I think there's some interesting applications and lots more that we'll see. I hope it can solve the Scope 3 data challenge for us, because that, I know is a big headache for so many organizations.
Yes, yeah, I think the scope three thing is, I mean, because it's so complicated, and the ability to run what if scenarios beyond what the human brain is capable of is definitely exciting and likely to lead to better outcomes. Thank you. So I love everything that you're saying, but isn't it true that external partnerships are the true key to unlocking progress and sustainability? Speaking of scope three
Mm.
emissions, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key. I think certainly external partnerships are an important part of an overall strategy. And, I generally see external partnerships, or we often call it ecosystem partnerships, as the key to sort of overcoming really difficult barriers, right? So they might enable collective investment to reduce individual cost, or maybe build leverage and scale to progress towards innovative solutions that haven't yet, reached sufficient scale to be cost effective, right? And so I think external partnerships are an important part of the strategy. But I think there's a couple of things to consider that sort of relate to the conversation today, right? One is just really being clear about your goals and ensure you're engaging in partnerships that support those goals. And so that seems obvious, but I think you often find that organizations do sometimes chase sort of the latest thing, right? So, don't get partnership happy, but focus on those kind of external collaborations that are really able to kind of overcome those key barriers or support your key goals. But I think when it comes to the organization, the key thing to think about is ensure that your organization is equipped to benefit from external partnerships, right? Because there might be a partnership that is aligned with your goals, that is maybe helping you to overcome the barriers. But what we actually see in our research around kind of ecosystem partnerships and sustainability is that one of the key barriers to actually effectively, leveraging these partnerships is internal workload. Right. So it might be, and I can say, from my own experience, that that's absolutely been a challenge in my past life in sustainability, right? You have so much to deliver on within the organization that you struggle to actually sufficiently leverage the benefits of those external partnerships. And so, really key to consider, you need to free up the time and space for your leaders to actually capture the value from those external partnerships. So, I would say external partnerships really important. Equipping the organization is actually kind of something that goes hand in hand with engaging in those external partnerships as well.
Right. That's great. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about that. Now we're going to move into the Q&A session. Thank you so much for everybody for submitting your questions. You can please submit your questions anytime. You still have time using the tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll not be using people's titles or company names, so you should feel free to ask anything you like. And if you don't see your question answered during the webinar, please be assured the team from Gartner will reach out to you offline. So let's get going with some of these questions. So Laura, you say we're at an inflection point in sustainability. Could you explain a little bit more about that and say how you think it's going to play out?
Absolutely. I think of the inflection point as sort of like that hype cycle that I shared earlier in the conversation, right? Where we are maybe struggling with this. We've had, we talked a lot about the say-do gap, right? Probably a year or so ago. I might have argued we were sort of closer to that peak of inflated expectations a year or two ago, right? And so we talked a lot about the say-do gap. Organizations have these really bold goals, but when you look at, some really good stakeholder assessments of are these goals feasible or who has a solid plan to achieve them. You could argue that few organizations truly had, the what was required to achieve the progress that they were seeking to achieve, say by 2030, right? And so Gartner has, a prediction that by 2030, most organizations, or I think it was even by 2026, a significant number of organizations would restate their interim goals, those 2030 goals, and actually, need to adjust them because we won't necessarily achieve them. So I think the key there is, I guess the inflection point that I'm referring to is one that helps us to kind of take a step back, and then, actually drive progress more authentically going forward. And we talk a lot about this kind of need to have authentic achievement of sustainability. I do see, this kind of reset moment where organizations are going to need, and are really starting to sort of create a stronger foundation for their sustainability programs going forward. And
Hmm.
yeah, so I think that it's around, and there might be a bifurcation there, right? There might then ultimately be some leaders and laggards, and leaders who are able to do that effectively, and laggards that continue to struggle to deliver.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure you're right about that. Thank you. Um, Here's an interesting question. How can supply chain be sustainable in an organization that is not manufacturing or producing goods?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. I mean, I think what I would suggest, I think there's a lot of ways that supply chains can be sustainable. Um, whether you're manufacturing or producing, or you're engaging maybe contract manufacturing, right? You've got others doing work for you, or if you're a, um, procurement leader, right, outside of a physical supply chain. I think in each of these cases there is often, buying power, and so that is one way in which you have the ability to drive action, right? Is leveraging that buying power, and again, kind of this idea of like aligning your sustainability goals with your decisions, right? So ensuring that we're sort of embedding sustainability into that procurement process, whether it's a direct procurement process or an indirect procurement process. If we're thinking about the movement of goods, there's absolutely opportunities there. And so, yeah, I think I'd be interested in kind of the specific type of organization in question, but certainly opportunities to leverage your influence. And when I speak with organizations generally, I do encourage thinking about, we're not going to change every little piece of our organization. We're going to need to lean on others to make some changes in, for example, you know, a tech organization might not necessarily have the power alone to green the grid, right? That might not be their role. Their role is to really make more efficient products that use less energy, and to work with their suppliers to be, to rely on renewable energy, right? So thinking about where do we actually have influence, right? Where do we have leverage, and where are our really material drivers of impact? And if we can think in that way, I think we can have influence in any sort of type of supply chain.
That's great. And touching on that subject of influence, have you seen the carrot or the stick approach working best among? I mean, because Gartner has a wide experience of
Yeah.
companies are doing this.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that I think about a lot. I think I want to say it's sort of in between. I think what I will say so far is most organizations that most of my clients have used more of a carrot with the intention to use a stick down the line, right? So you see a lot of organizations saying, we're going to start with the carrot. We're going to really encourage progress and continuous improvement. But there is going to be a point where we're going to say, okay, you're on the bus or you're not, right? And so I think that's one way that we're seeing, organizations try to kind of ease and support their suppliers to get on the journey, but also, eventually make sure that they need to make some tough decisions. Um, I generally encourage kind of, I don't like to think of it as a carrot or a stick myself, because I like to think
Right.
of it as a partnership and actually an opportunity to look inward. And I think a lot of, when we look at incentives and the types of incentives that work, we actually find that the most opportunity is in the structural incentives, which mean, how are we making our buying decisions? And I know I'm